There is a particular kind of exhaustion that has no name in most conversations about well-being, and yet almost everyone carries it. It is the exhaustion of being misread and rushing to fix it. Someone forms the wrong impression of you, and before the thought has even settled into words, your mind is already assembling the correction, the message you will send, the context you will add, the version of events that will finally make them see you clearly. Most people never question this reflex. It feels like responsibility. It feels like honesty. It feels like the bare minimum required to be understood by the people around you. But there is a quieter possibility that almost no one considers, and it is this: what if the compulsion to correct every misunderstanding is not protecting your reputation at all? What if it is slowly dismantling something far more valuable, your own sense of internal steadiness? In this audiobook, you will discover why the ability to let people misunderstand you, without chasing them down with explanations, without performing your intentions, without needing the record set straight, is one of the most underdeveloped forms of personal power available to a human mind. This is not a lesson in indifference. It is not about becoming detached from truth or careless about how you treat others. It is about recognizing a distinction that most people never draw: the difference between being known and being approved of. You will learn why every unnecessary explanation quietly teaches your nervous system that other people's perceptions are the final authority on your worth. You will learn why the people who seem the most grounded, the most unbothered, the most quietly magnetic, are often not the ones who explain the best. They are the ones who explain the least. You will learn what happens inside a mind that stops treating misunderstanding as an emergency and starts treating it as simply one more thing that happens sometimes, like weather, like traffic, like the ordinary friction of being a person among other people. And by the end, you will understand a truth that changes the way you move through every relationship you have. The moment you no longer need to be understood by everyone is the moment you finally become impossible to control. Chapter 1. The reflex to correct. There is a particular kind of jolt that happens in the body when someone gets you wrong. Maybe a colleague implies you were dismissive in a meeting when you were actually just tired. Maybe a friend reads a short text as cold when you meant it as efficient. Maybe a stranger online decides, from a single sentence, that they know exactly who you are and what you believe. In that instant, before any conscious decision is made, something in you moves. Your chest tightens slightly. Your mind starts drafting a response. Your fingers may already be typing before you've asked yourself whether typing is even necessary. This is the reflex to correct, and it is one of the most automatic behaviors a person can have. It does not feel like a choice. It feels like a duty, almost a physical necessity. The way flinching from a hot stove feels necessary. Something wrong has entered the world, and you are the only one positioned to fix it. If you don't say something, the wrong impression will simply sit there, uncorrected, hardening into fact. So you speak. You clarify. You explain. You add the context, the nuance, the "what I actually meant was." Most people never examine this reflex because it wears such a convincing disguise. It dresses itself as honesty. It dresses itself as fairness. It dresses itself as the simple, decent act of making sure the record is straight. Who could object to that? Correcting a misunderstanding seems like one of the more virtuous things a person can do, right up there with returning a wallet or admitting a mistake. And sometimes it genuinely is that virtuous. There are moments when clarity matters, when leaving a false impression uncorrected would cause real harm, when silence would be a kind of cowardice. But if you watch the reflex closely, over weeks and months, in dozens of small moments, a different pattern starts to emerge. The urge to correct rarely announces itself only in high-stakes situations. It shows up just as forcefully over trivial ones. Someone misreads your tone in a group chat about restaurant plans. Someone assumes you didn't read an email you did read. Someone thinks you're annoyed when you're merely quiet. None of these moments carry any real consequence. No one's safety, reputation, or well-being depends on the correction. And yet the pull to explain is just as strong, sometimes stronger, than it is when something actually matters. This is the first clue that the reflex is not really about accuracy. If it were purely about accuracy, it would scale with stakes. It would feel urgent when urgency was warranted, and quiet when it wasn't. Instead, it behaves more like an alarm system that cannot tell the difference between a house fire and a dropped plate. Both trigger the same response: sirens, adrenaline, an overwhelming need to act immediately. What the reflex is actually protecting is not truth. It is a felt sense of coherence, a private, often unspoken belief that other people's understanding of you needs to match your understanding of yourself in order for you to feel stable. When someone's perception drifts from that internal picture, it doesn't register as merely inaccurate. It registers as a kind of fracture. The self you know yourself to be, and the self that now exists in someone else's mind, have split apart, and some part of you experiences that split as intolerable, as something that must be sealed shut immediately, the way you might press a cloth to a wound before you've even assessed how deep it is. This is worth sitting with, because it reframes the whole behavior. The reflex to correct isn't really a response to what the other person said. It's a response to the discomfort of existing, even briefly, as two different versions of yourself at once. The one you carry inside, and the one now living, unauthorized, in someone else's head. Explaining is the attempt to collapse those two versions back into one. It is less, let me tell you the truth, and more, let me make this feeling stop. Once you see it this way, certain patterns in your own life may start to make more sense. Why you've stayed up rereading a text message, composing and deleting 3 different replies. Why an offhand comment from someone whose opinion barely matters to you can occupy your thoughts for the rest of the day. Why you sometimes feel a strange relief after finally sending the clarifying message, even though nothing about the actual situation has changed, except that you've spoken. The relief isn't evidence that the correction was necessary. It's evidence that the discomfort has been discharged, which is a different thing entirely. None of this means the impulse is bad, or that you should suppress it out of some new rule that correcting people is always unnecessary. That would just be trading one reflex for another, a different kind of automatic behavior, dressed up as wisdom. The point of noticing the reflex is not to eliminate it, but to loosen its grip enough that you can see the moment of choice hiding inside it. Before the reflex, there is always a sliver of space, easy to miss, where you could ask yourself a simple question: does this misunderstanding actually cost me anything? Or does it only cost me the discomfort of being misunderstood? Those are not the same thing, even though they feel identical in the moment. A misunderstanding that costs you something real, a job, a relationship, a reputation you've earned, deserves a response. A misunderstanding that costs you nothing except the internal itch of not being perfectly seen deserves, at minimum, a pause. Not necessarily silence forever. Just a pause long enough to notice that the urgency you're feeling is not coming from the situation. It's coming from you. This is where the real work of this book begins, not in learning new scripts for how to explain yourself more effectively, but in learning to recognize the moment the reflex fires, and in getting curious about it instead of obeying it automatically. That curiosity is not comfortable at first. The reflex has had a long, uncontested run, but underneath it is a quieter, sturdier way of moving through the world. One where being misunderstood sometimes is simply part of being a person among other people, and not a crisis that requires your immediate intervention. Chapter 2. Why misunderstanding feels like danger. If you ask most people why they feel compelled to correct a wrong impression, they will usually reach for a reasonable-sounding answer. They will say they care about honesty, or that they don't want to be misjudged unfairly, or that leaving things unclear feels sloppy. These answers aren't false, exactly, but they are surface explanations for something that runs much deeper and much older than any individual's personal values around honesty. The body does not treat being misunderstood as a neutral event. For many people, it registers as something closer to threat. A faster heartbeat, a tightening in the stomach, a mind that suddenly can't focus on anything else until the record is set straight. This is a strange thing when you stop to examine it. Nothing physical has happened, no one has taken anything from you, and yet the nervous system responds as if something has, because in a very real evolutionary sense, something has. Human beings evolved in small groups, where social standing was not a metaphor. It was survival infrastructure. To be misjudged by the group, seen as untrustworthy, disloyal, incompetent, or dangerous, was not a minor social inconvenience. It could mean exclusion, and exclusion from the group in the environments our ancestors lived in could mean death. There was no surviving alone on the savannah for long. The tribe's perception of you was not a side detail of your life. It was, in a very direct way, the thing keeping you alive. This is why the nervous system treats a misunderstanding with such disproportionate urgency. It isn't calibrating its response to the actual modern stakes, a slightly awkward text thread, a co-worker's passing assumption. It's running an ancient piece of software that was built for a world where the group's opinion of you functioned as a survival resource, and where a false impression left uncorrected could spread and calcify into something that got you cast out. The wiring hasn't caught up to the fact that today, most misunderstandings dissolve on their own, cost nothing, and are forgotten by the other person within the hour. There's a second layer to this, sitting just beneath the evolutionary one, and it has to do with identity rather than survival in the strict sense. For most people, a stable sense of self depends partly on external mirroring, on other people reflecting back something that roughly matches the internal sense of who you are. When someone perceives you in a way that clashes sharply with your self-concept, calling you cold when you think of yourself as warm, careless when you think of yourself as conscientious, it does more than annoy you. It briefly destabilizes the story you tell yourself about who you are. And a destabilized self-story is, for the mind, its own kind of danger signal, because identity is one of the load-bearing structures a person relies on to function. This is worth naming plainly. Misunderstanding doesn't just threaten your reputation, it threatens your self-narrative. If you believe yourself to be a generous person, and someone treats you as stingy, the discomfort you feel isn't purely about their opinion of you. It's about a crack appearing, even briefly, in the story you've built and depend on. The urge to correct them is, underneath it, an urge to repair that crack before it has time to widen, before you have to sit with the unsettling possibility, even for a moment, that the story might not be perfectly accurate, or that it might not be entirely up to you to control how it's read by others. It helps to notice that this threat response does not discriminate between people who matter to you and people who don't. A misjudgment from someone whose opinion has real bearing on your life, a boss, a partner, a close friend, can trigger the same intensity of reaction as a misjudgment from a stranger you'll never interact with again. If the danger response were tracking actual risk, it would scale accordingly. It largely doesn't, which tells you something important. The alarm isn't really about that specific person's opinion. It's about the general, background sense that your image in the world needs to be actively managed at all times by you, or it will drift into something unrecognizable and unsafe. Once you can see the mechanism this clearly, the next useful step is learning to name it in the moment it's happening. Not "I need to fix this," but "my nervous system currently believes something serious is at risk, and it is worth checking whether that's actually true." This isn't about talking yourself out of your feelings. The discomfort is real and deserves acknowledgement. But there is a meaningful difference between feeling the old alarm and obeying it without question. The alarm evolved for tribal survival, not for navigating a group chat or an offhand comment from a coworker who will forget the exchange by lunchtime. There is also something quietly freeing in recognizing that this reaction is common, almost universal, rather than a personal flaw. The heat that rises when you're misjudged is not a sign of insecurity unique to you. It's closer to a shared inheritance, the same nervous system, responding the same way it has responded in humans for a very long time. Understanding that doesn't make the feeling disappear, but it changes your relationship to it. Instead of an emergency demanding action, it can become a familiar, almost predictable weather pattern passing through. Intense, but not permanent, and not, in most cases, actually telling you the truth about what's at stake. The real question this chapter is building toward is not how to stop feeling the alarm. That may not be possible, and it may not even be desirable, since some version of this wiring keeps people attentive to real social risk. The real question is how to keep the alarm from being the one making all your decisions. That distinction between feeling threatened and being obligated to act on the feeling is where the next chapters begin to do their work. Chapter 3. The hidden cost of constant clarification. It is easy to think of clarification as free. You send a follow-up message, you add a caveat, you spend 2 minutes explaining what you actually meant, and then the moment passes and life continues. Measured this way, the cost looks negligible. But this accounting misses almost everything that actually happens when a person makes a habit of interrupting their life to manage how they're being perceived. The first cost is attentional, and it is larger than it appears. Every time a misunderstanding surfaces and the reflex to correct fires, a portion of your mental bandwidth gets rerouted toward that person's perception of you. You might be in the middle of something else entirely. Working, resting, being present with someone you love, and a notification or a memory of an earlier exchange pulls a thread loose. Suddenly, part of your mind is drafting a response, rehearsing an explanation, replaying the moment that caused the misunderstanding in the first place. Even if you never actually send anything, the mental energy has already been spent. Attention, unlike time, doesn't return cleanly to where it left off. Something is always slightly diminished in whatever you were doing before the interruption. Over the course of a day, this adds up in a way most people never total. A single correction here, a clarifying message there, a few minutes of internal rehearsals scattered throughout. None of it looks significant in isolation, But a life lived this way is a life with a persistent low-grade tax on attention, paid out constantly to an audience that in most cases was not asking for the payment and will not particularly remember receiving it. The second cost is harder to see because it doesn't show up as lost time. It shows up as a subtle shift in posture, in how a person carries themselves through their own life. When you are frequently monitoring how you're being perceived and standing ready to correct any drift, you are, in a very real sense, living slightly outside yourself. Part of your attention is always positioned as an observer, watching the room watch you, tracking whether the impression being formed matches the one you intend. This is an exhausting place to live from, because it means you are never fully inside your own experience. You are always partly managing a second, simultaneous project, your own reception. This has a name worth using plainly: self-consciousness as a chronic condition rather than an occasional visitor. Most people experience self-consciousness in specific, bounded situations: a job interview, a first date, a public speech. It arrives, does its work, and departs once the situation ends. But for someone who has built the habit of constant clarification, self-consciousness stops being situational and becomes more like ambient weather, present in ordinary conversations, casual texts, even solitary moments spent replaying how something might have come across. Presence and self-monitoring cannot fully coexist. To the degree you are managing your image, you are, by definition, not fully where you are. There is also a cost to dignity that is worth naming directly, even though it can feel uncomfortable to look at. Every unnecessary clarification carries within it a small, implicit message: your opinion of me is something I cannot leave alone. Said once, in an important moment, this communicates care. Said constantly, over small and inconsequential things, it starts to communicate something closer to dependency, an inability to tolerate even minor gaps between how you see yourself and how you are seen. People on the receiving end of constant clarification often sense this, even if they can't articulate it. There's a difference between a person who explains themselves when it matters and a person who seems unable to let anything sit uncorrected. The former reads as thoughtful. The latter, over time, can read as anxious, even if the individual explanations are perfectly reasonable on their own. This is not a moral failing. It is a pattern that develops honestly, often out of real past experiences, where being misunderstood did carry consequences, and where correcting the record was, at some point, genuinely necessary for safety or survival in a relationship, a family, a workplace. The habit made sense when it formed. The problem is that habits, once formed, tend to keep running long after the original conditions that justified them have changed. A person who learned as a child that any misread intention could lead to punishment or withdrawal of love may carry that vigilance into adulthood, applying it to situations: a stranger's passing assumption, a casual joke misheard, that no longer carry anything like the original stakes. There is a third cost, quieter than the first two, but perhaps the most corrosive over time: the erosion of your own relationship with uncertainty. A person who habitually smooths over every misunderstanding never gets the chance to practice tolerating the discomfort of being unclear to someone else. That tolerance is a skill, and like any skill, it atrophies without use. The less you practice sitting with being misjudged, the more unbearable each new instance of it feels, which in turn makes the reflex to correct even stronger the next time. It becomes a loop that tightens rather than loosens. Less tolerance leads to more correcting, which leads to less practice at tolerance. which leads to even less capacity to withstand the next misunderstanding. None of this is an argument for never explaining yourself. There are real conversations that need real clarity, real misunderstandings that genuinely deserve correction, real relationships where explaining yourself is an act of intimacy rather than anxiety. The argument here is narrower and more precise, that the habit of reflexive, constant clarification carries costs that rarely get counted, because each individual instance looks so small. It is only when you add them up, the attention spent, the presence forfeited, the quiet erosion of your own tolerance for being misunderstood, that the true price becomes visible. And once it's visible, it becomes possible to ask a different question than, how do I explain this better? Namely, is this one of the explanations that actually needs to happen? Or is it one more small payment toward a debt I never agreed to owe? Chapter 4. The difference between being known and being approved of. There is a confusion at the center of most people's relationship to being misunderstood. And it is worth pulling apart carefully, because the two things it conflates feel identical in the moment, but lead to entirely different lives. The confusion is this: being known and being approved of are treated as though they are the same project, when in fact they are almost opposites in what they require of you. Being known means that someone has an accurate, textured understanding of who you actually are, your motives, your history, your contradictions, the parts of you that don't resolve neatly. Being known does not require agreement. It does not require warmth. It does not even require that the other person likes what they find. Two people can know each other deeply and still disagree, still find each other frustrating, still choose not to be close. Knowledge and approval are separable, even though it rarely feels that way in the heat of an interaction. Being approved of is a different transaction entirely. It means that someone's opinion of you currently lands somewhere favorable, and it is inherently unstable because approval is a moving target shaped by the other person's mood, their own unresolved histories, their momentary interpretation of an ambiguous situation. Approval can be lost over something as trivial as a poorly timed joke or a tired tone of voice on a hard day. It fluctuates constantly, often for reasons that have little to do with you, and everything to do with the person doing the approving. The reflex to correct, examined honestly, is almost always in service of approval, not knowledge. When someone forms a wrong impression, and the urgency rises to fix it immediately, the underlying goal usually isn't, I need this person to have an accurate picture of my inner life. It's closer to, I cannot tolerate this person currently holding an unfavorable view of me, and I need that view to shift back to something more comfortable right now. This is worth sitting with, because it reframes what looks like a pursuit of truth as something closer to a pursuit of comfort. The explanation gets dressed in the language of honesty. I just want to clear this up, but its real engine is the desire to be seen favorably again, as quickly as possible. This distinction matters enormously for how a person builds relationships, because a life organized around securing approval produces a very different shape than a life organized around being genuinely known. Approval seeking requires constant vigilance and constant adjustment. It means monitoring reactions in real time and recalibrating your presentation whenever you sense disapproval forming, even slightly. Over years, this produces a self that has been sanded down at every point where it generated friction, not because those points were wrong, but because they were unpopular in some specific moment with some specific person. The result is often a person who is widely liked, and almost nowhere fully known, because the parts of them that might have produced disapproval were quietly edited out along the way. Being known requires something almost opposite, a willingness to let the friction stand sometimes. To let someone see a part of you that they might not like, without immediately smoothing it over. To tolerate the discomfort of someone holding, even temporarily, an impression of you that isn't flattering, because the alternative, constantly managing their view of you, means they never get access to anything real enough to actually know. Real relationships are built out of accumulated instances of being seen accurately, including the unflattering parts, and surviving that exposure without immediately papering over it. A relationship where every unflattering impression gets corrected within minutes is a relationship that never gets the chance to develop the kind of trust that comes from having weathered something real together. This doesn't mean you should never explain yourself, or that clarity is somehow a betrayal of authenticity. Explanation has its place, and there are people in your life who deserve context because the relationship is built on mutual understanding, not performance. The distinction isn't explain versus never explain. It's noticing which impulse is driving the explanation in a given moment. An explanation offered because a relationship depends on shared understanding is a form of intimacy. An explanation offered because you cannot bear a moment of someone's disapproval is a form of anxiety wearing intimacy's clothing. One useful way to tell the difference in the moment is to ask what would happen if the explanation simply didn't land, if the other person heard it and remained unconvinced, still holding their original, less favorable impression. If that outcome feels unbearable, if the entire point of the explanation was to guarantee a shift back to approval, that's usually a signal that approval, not understanding, was the actual goal. If, on the other hand, you could offer the explanation, have it not change their mind, and still feel basically intact, that's usually a sign you were explaining for the sake of honesty, rather than for the sake of managing their reaction. There is a kind of freedom available on the other side of this distinction, though it doesn't arrive easily. It's the freedom of no longer treating every fluctuation in someone's opinion of you as a 5-alarm event requiring immediate response. It's the freedom of being able to say, internally, they've got me wrong right now, and that's uncomfortable, but it doesn't mean I need to intervene, and meaning it, rather than gritting your teeth through the discomfort, while secretly composing the correction anyway. That freedom doesn't come from caring less about people. It comes from caring more about being known by the people who matter, and less about being universally, immediately approved of by everyone who happens to form an impression of you, including people whose opinion was never going to shape your life in any lasting way. Chapter 5. Who actually needs the explanation? There is a question that, once asked honestly, tends to unravel a great deal of the reflex this book has been examining. When you feel the urge to explain yourself, who is that explanation actually for? The assumption baked into the reflex is that the explanation exists for the other person, that they are the ones who need the missing context, who deserve the clarification, who will be better off once they understand what you actually meant. And sometimes this is true. There are situations where someone genuinely benefits from more information, where their misunderstanding is actively causing a problem for them, not just for your comfort. But if you observe the reflex closely across many situations, a striking pattern emerges. A large percentage of the explanations that feel most urgent are not, in fact, requested, needed, or particularly wanted by the person receiving them. They are wanted intensely by the person giving them. This is easiest to see in retrospect. Think of a time you sent a lengthy clarifying message after a minor miscommunication, only to receive a short, slightly puzzled reply. Something like, "Oh, no worries, I wasn't even thinking about it that way." In that moment, it becomes clear that the explanation was solving a problem that existed almost entirely on your side of the conversation. The other person wasn't sitting with any real discomfort about the misunderstanding. You were. The explanation wasn't information they needed. It was relief you needed, dressed up as information. This happens because unresolved ambiguity is genuinely hard for the nervous system to sit with, and explaining is one of the most reliable, immediate ways to resolve it. The moment you send the clarifying message, even before any reply comes back, something in you settles. You've done something. You've acted. The open loop, however minor, has been addressed. This relief is real, but it's worth being honest about where it's coming from. It is the relief of your own anxious mind quieting down, not necessarily evidence that the other person's understanding of you has meaningfully improved, or that they were waiting for the correction in the first place. Once you start looking for this pattern, you begin to notice it almost everywhere. The reflex to correct shows up. The coworker who needs to know you weren't ignoring their message, when in reality, they hadn't noticed a delay at all. The acquaintance who needs to understand your joke wasn't meant that way, when they'd already moved on to the next topic without a second thought. The stranger online who needs to see your reasoning laid out in full, when they will read your explanation, remain unmoved and forget the entire exchange within the hour. In each case, the explanation gets framed as an act of consideration for the other person, when it is more accurately an act of self-soothing for the one giving it. This is not a flattering realization, and it's worth sitting with the discomfort of it, rather than rushing past it. It means that a significant portion of what feels like generosity, taking the time to clarify, to make sure someone isn't left with a wrong impression, is often closer to a private anxiety management strategy that happens to be aimed at another person. This doesn't make the impulse shameful. It makes it human, but it does mean the story we tell ourselves about why we explain, "I'm just being thoughtful," deserves a second look, because thoughtfulness and anxiety can produce nearly identical behavior while being motivated by very different things. There's a useful diagnostic question buried in this recognition. If the other person never found out you'd been misunderstood by them, would anything in their life actually be worse off? Often, honestly answered, the answer is no. Their life would continue exactly as it would have otherwise. The only life that would be different is yours, because you would still be carrying the discomfort of an uncorrected impression, unresolved, unaddressed. That discomfort is real and deserves acknowledgement. But it's worth naming clearly that it is your discomfort, arising from your relationship with being misunderstood, not evidence that the correction serves some larger purpose for the other person. This reframing changes the calculus considerably. Instead of asking, "Does this misunderstanding need to be corrected?" which almost always seems to produce a yes. Since misunderstandings feel inherently uncomfortable, you can start asking a more precise question. Whose discomfort would this correction actually be addressing? If the honest answer is mine, primarily, that doesn't automatically mean you shouldn't say anything. Sometimes managing your own discomfort well is a perfectly legitimate reason to speak, especially if staying silent would leave you distracted or resentful for the rest of the day. But it does mean you're choosing to speak for your own sake, with clear eyes about it, rather than under the illusion that you're performing some necessary service for the other person, who, in most cases, was not particularly troubled to begin with. There's something quietly clarifying about naming this honestly, instead of dressing the impulse up in the language of consideration for others. It removes a layer of self-deception that, left unexamined, tends to keep the reflex running indefinitely, since "I'm just being fair to them" is a much harder story to question than "I'm uncomfortable and want this feeling to stop." Once you can see the second story clearly, you gain something valuable: the ability to address your own discomfort directly, through means other than explaining yourself to people who were never particularly bothered in the first place. Sometimes that means tolerating the discomfort briefly and letting it pass on its own, the way most passing discomforts eventually do. Sometimes it means talking to someone who actually is affected by how you're being perceived: a close friend, a partner, someone whose understanding of you genuinely shapes your shared life together. But it starts with the honest recognition that the explanation you feel so compelled to give is, more often than not, a gift you're giving yourself, addressed to someone else's inbox. Chapter 6. The people who never explain themselves. Almost everyone has met someone like this, a person who gets visibly misread, sometimes in a way that would send most people scrambling to correct the record, and simply lets it happen. Someone accuses them of something they didn't do, or draws an unflattering conclusion from a partial picture, and instead of the expected flurry of clarification, there's just a kind of stillness, maybe a small shrug, maybe a brief, unbothered acknowledgement. That's not quite how it happened, but okay. And then a return to whatever they were doing before. No campaign to set things right, no lingering irritation, no visible need to make sure the room walks away with a correct impression. The first time you encounter this in someone, it can be disorienting, almost unsettling. It violates an unspoken assumption most people carry, that a wrong impression, left standing, is a kind of unfinished business, a loose thread that will unravel something if it isn't tied off. Watching someone simply not tie it off and seem completely fine forces a quiet reconsideration of whether that assumption was ever actually true. What's striking about people who carry this quality is that it rarely reads as indifference. Indifference has a coldness to it, a sense of not caring about the relationship or the outcome. What this looks like instead is closer to security. The sense that the person's understanding of themselves does not depend on winning every interpretation battle in real time. They are not pretending not to care what others think. Most of them do care, in the ordinary human way. What they've developed is the capacity to care, without needing immediate resolution, to let a false impression sit, unaddressed, without it destabilizing anything essential in them. This composure is often mistaken for confidence in the generic sense, the kind people associate with assertiveness or charisma. But it's really something more specific and more interesting, an internal reference point strong enough that it doesn't require constant external confirmation. Picture two people, both misjudged in the same way by the same critical acquaintance. One person spends the rest of the day replaying the conversation, drafting mental rebuttals, feeling faintly diminished until the record gets set straight. The other notices the misjudgment, perhaps feels a flicker of the same discomfort, and then continues with their day largely unaffected. The difference between them isn't that the second person doesn't have an ego or doesn't want to be understood. It's that their sense of who they are, isn't being rented, moment to moment, from whoever happens to be in the room. There's a magnetism to this quality that's worth naming honestly, because it explains why these people are often described as calm, grounded, hard to rattle, even by people who can't quite articulate why. Watching someone remain unbothered by a misreading of them signals something to everyone around them. Whether or not it's consciously registered, this person is not for sale to your opinion of them. That kind of steadiness draws people in, partly because it's rare, and partly because it offers a kind of relief. Being around someone who isn't constantly managing how they're perceived means you can be a little less careful yourself. There's more room to be human, to make an offhand comment or a joke that lands wrong, without triggering a whole negotiation over what was really meant. It would be a mistake, though, to think this composure arrives naturally, as some inborn temperament that either you have or you don't. For most people who display it, it was built, often slowly, often through some combination of experience and deliberate practice, sometimes through hard-won clarity that came from being misunderstood in ways that once felt catastrophic, and turning out, on the other side of it, to be fine. Somewhere along the way, they ran the experiment enough times, being misjudged and not correcting it, to gather real evidence that the sky did not fall. That evidence is what eventually replaces the reflex to correct with something calmer. Not suppression of the reflex, but genuine of the fear underneath it. This matters because it means the composure isn't reserved for a certain kind of person. It's available to anyone willing to tolerate the discomfort of a few uncorrected misunderstandings long enough to notice that nothing catastrophic follows. Each time you let a small, low-stakes misreading pass without intervening, and observe that your life, your relationships, your sense of self remain intact, you are quietly building the same kind of evidence these people have built. The stillness isn't a trait. It's closer to a callus, formed through repeated, survivable contact with exactly the kind of discomfort this book has been examining. It's also worth being precise about what this composure is not, because it's easy to romanticize it into something it isn't. It is not the same as never explaining anything, ever, as a matter of principle. People who move through the world this way still clarify things, when clarity actually serves the relationship or the situation. What they've lost isn't the capacity to explain themselves. It's the compulsive, anxious edge that used to accompany the impulse, the sense that an uncorrected impression was an emergency. They've kept the tool and discarded the panic that used to come attached to it. There is also a quieter, more private form of self-respect embedded in this composure that's easy to overlook. Constantly explaining yourself, however politely it's framed, carries a subtle implication that other people's momentary read of you holds authority over your own sense of who you are. The person who doesn't explain themselves in every instance is making a different, quieter claim that their self-understanding doesn't require ratification by everyone who happens to form an opinion. This isn't arrogance. It's closer to a kind of internal sovereignty, an unwillingness to hand out veto power over your identity to every passing interpretation. However wrong, none of this means composure should be performed, worn like an aesthetic, a studied coolness deployed to seem unbothered, while secretly seething underneath. That version is just the reflex to correct wearing a disguise, redirected into a different kind of performance, rather than actually resolved. The real thing is quieter and less visible than that. It doesn't need to be demonstrated, because it isn't for anyone's benefit. It shows up as an absence rather than a display. The absence of the follow-up text, the absence of the rehearsed rebuttal, the absence of the low hum of unfinished business, trailing behind an interaction that, for most people, would have demanded resolution. What's left in that absence is simply a person getting on with their life, trusting that being misread here and there is survivable, because it always has been. Chapter 7. Letting the story be incomplete. There is an assumption worth examining directly, because it sits underneath so much of the reflex to correct. The belief that if you don't actively manage what people know about you, the resulting picture they carry will be false, or at least badly incomplete. And that incompleteness is itself a kind of dishonesty you're responsible for preventing. This assumption deserves more scrutiny than it usually gets. Every person who has ever known you has known an incomplete version of you. Your closest friend of 20 years doesn't have the full picture. Neither does your partner, your sibling, your therapist, or anyone else, no matter how much time and honesty you've shared with them. This isn't a failure of intimacy. It's simply the nature of being known by another mind, which can only ever hold a partial rendering of the whole, constructed from what's been shown, said, and inferred over time, filtered through that other person's own perceptual limits and history. Completeness was never actually on the table, with anyone, ever. What varies is not whether the picture is incomplete, but how incomplete, and whether you can tolerate that fact without treating every gap as a wound requiring immediate suturing. Once this is genuinely accepted, rather than just intellectually acknowledged, the pressure behind constant clarification loses a great deal of its force. If completeness was never achievable in the first place, then a specific gap left by a specific misunderstanding isn't a unique failure demanding urgent repair. It's simply one more instance of the ordinary incompleteness that characterizes being known by anyone at all. The question shifts from, how do I close this gap, to, is this a gap that actually matters, in a relationship that actually matters, or is it simply one more piece of the ordinary static that comes with existing among other people who can't see the whole of you? There's an important distinction to draw here between leaving a story incomplete and actively deceiving someone. These get conflated easily because both involve someone holding an inaccurate picture. But the mechanism and the intention are entirely different. Deception involves actively constructing a false impression, choosing your words or your silences specifically to mislead someone toward a conclusion you know to be untrue, usually for some kind of personal advantage. Letting a story remain incomplete is something else. It's simply not intervening every single time someone's natural, unprompted inference happens to land somewhere slightly off. You didn't build the misunderstanding. You just didn't rush to demolish it the moment it appeared. That's not lying. That's tolerance for a normal feature of human perception, which is that people fill in gaps with guesses, and guesses are sometimes wrong, and that wrongness usually isn't anyone's fault, including yours. This distinction matters because a lot of the guilt driving the reflex to correct comes from a quiet, often unexamined fear of being complicit in a lie, simply by not immediately correcting a mistaken impression. But silence in the face of someone else's incorrect inference is not the same moral event as constructing that inference yourself. If a coworker assumes you stayed late because you're diligent, when actually you stayed late because your ride was delayed, letting that assumption stand isn't dishonest. You didn't create it. It arose on its own, out of their reasonable but incomplete information. And choosing not to correct something so trivial isn't a moral failing. It's simply declining to spend your limited time and energy managing an inference that carries no real weight. There's something deeper available here, though, beyond simple risk assessment about which gaps matter and which don't. Letting the story be incomplete as a general posture rather than a case-by-case calculation is actually an expression of trust, specifically trust in your own stability. If your sense of self depended on every observer holding an accurate, complete picture of you at all times, you would be handing enormous power to circumstance. Since it is simply impossible to control what conclusions people draw from partial information, especially people who only see slices of your life. But if your sense of self doesn't depend on that, if it's anchored instead in your own ongoing relationship with yourself, then other people's incomplete pictures of you stop being existential threats and become simply what they are: their limited view, not the final word on who you actually are. This is easier to describe than to inhabit, especially for anyone who has spent years operating under the opposite assumption. It can feel almost irresponsible at first, letting an inaccurate impression stand without moving to fix it, as though you're being careless with your own reputation. But there's a useful reframe available. Think about how much of your understanding of anyone else in your life is built from incomplete information you've simply never had corrected and never needed corrected because the incompleteness didn't actually change your ability to have a real relationship with them. You likely hold dozens of small, slightly inaccurate impressions of people you care about right now, harmless gaps and minor misreadings that have simply never come up. Their lives have not been damaged by your incomplete picture of them. Yours will survive other people's incomplete pictures of you in the same way. There's also a kind of dignity that comes from allowing yourself to be known gradually, rather than explained exhaustively. A person who tries to close every gap immediately, who cannot tolerate an unfinished impression for even a day, ends up presenting themselves less like a person and more like a document under constant revision, always being annotated, always issuing corrections. A person who allows the picture to fill in naturally, over time, through accumulated experience rather than active management, ends up being known in a way that feels more organic, less curated, and ultimately more trustworthy, precisely because it wasn't obviously engineered. This doesn't mean gaps should never be addressed. Some incomplete stories do real damage and deserve correction, particularly in relationships where trust is actively being built or repaired, or in situations where someone's inaccurate impression could cause you concrete harm. The point isn't that all incompleteness is fine. It's that incompleteness, by default, is not an emergency. It's the baseline condition of being known by another mind at all. Learning to let it sit, most of the time, without rushing to intervene, isn't a lapse in honesty. It's a quiet vote of confidence in the fact that you remain who you are, whether or not that fact has been fully communicated to everyone currently forming an opinion of you. Chapter 8. The Trap of Performing Your Intentions. There is a particular kind of exhaustion that comes from a specific habit, not just correcting misunderstandings about what you did, but going further, trying to prove what you meant by it. This is a subtler and more demanding project than simple clarification, because intentions, unlike facts, can never be fully verified. You can show someone a receipt, a timestamp, a text message, and settle a factual dispute. You cannot produce equivalent evidence for your inner state. And yet the impulse to try, to demonstrate good intentions as convincingly as if they were external facts, is one of the most persistent and least examined forms the reflex to correct can take. This habit usually starts reasonably enough. Someone misreads an action as careless when it was actually careful, or as selfish when it was actually protective of someone else, and the instinct to explain the real motive behind the action feels like simple fairness. But watch this pattern over time, across many relationships and situations, and something becomes visible. The explanations rarely stop at a single clarification. They tend to escalate, adding more context, more backstory, more evidence of good faith, as though the right combination of words could finally produce airtight proof of an internal state that by its nature cannot be fully proven to anyone, including sometimes to yourself. The deeper problem with this pattern is not that it fails, though it often does fail to fully convince anyone, since people are rarely persuaded of someone else's intentions through argument alone. The deeper problem is what the habit does to the person performing it. Every time you find yourself needing to prove your intentions were good, you are implicitly treating your own word, your own sense of yourself, as insufficient evidence. You are outsourcing the verification of your character to whoever happens to be skeptical of you in that moment, and asking them to certify, through their acceptance of your explanation, that you are in fact the person you believe yourself to be. This is a strange transaction to keep entering into, because it means your own self-knowledge, the one thing you actually have direct access to, gets treated as inadequate until an outside party signs off on it. Over time, this produces something like the opposite of confidence, even though it often starts from a place of wanting to protect a reputation for good character. Confidence, in its more durable form, involves trusting your own read of your motives enough that you don't need it externally ratified every time someone questions it. The habit of performing your intentions does the reverse. It trains you to look outward for confirmation of something only you can actually know, and each successful performance, each moment where an explanation manages to satisfy a skeptical listener, doesn't actually build your inner confidence. It just reinforces the pattern of needing that external nod in the first place. The relief you feel when someone finally says, "Oh, okay, I understand now, that makes sense," isn't evidence of growing self-assurance. It's evidence of a system that has just been fed and will need feeding again the next time your intentions are questioned. There's a particularly corrosive version of this trap that deserves specific attention: the performance of intentions to people who were never going to be persuaded, regardless of what you said. Some skepticism isn't actually open to resolution through explanation, because it isn't really about the specific action in question. It's rooted in something else entirely: the other person's own history, their general disposition towards suspicion, an unrelated grievance they're carrying, or simply a fixed narrative about you that they've already decided on, and are unlikely to revise no matter what evidence you present. Trying to prove good intentions to someone operating from a fixed narrative is a bit like trying to win an argument with someone who has already decided the outcome before it starts. No amount of explanation moves the needle, because the explanation was never actually the variable determining their opinion. And yet, the performing continues, sometimes for years, in certain relationships, because stopping feels like conceding that the other person's unfair read of you might be allowed to stand unchallenged. This is where the trap closes most tightly, because the very people most likely to keep demanding proof of good intentions are often the ones least likely to ever accept it. Reasonable people generally extend a baseline of good faith and don't require repeated performances to maintain it. People who consistently need convincing, who treat every clarification as insufficient and ask for further proof, are often signaling something about their own relationship to trust that has little to do with you specifically. Recognizing this distinction between people who need occasional honest clarification and people who require an ongoing performance that will never actually satisfy them is one of the more valuable discernments a person can develop, because it prevents an enormous amount of wasted effort directed at an audience that was never going to grant the verdict being sought. There is also something worth noticing about what gets sacrificed while all this proving is happening. A person deep in the habit of performing their intentions often becomes hyper-attuned to how their actions might be read before they've even acted, running mental simulations of potential misinterpretations and preloading justifications in advance. This looks like foresight, but it functions more like a tax on spontaneity. Decisions that should be simple, sending a blunt but efficient message, declining an invitation without an elaborate excuse, saying no without a paragraph of softening context, become complicated by an internal audit of how the choice will be perceived and whether it will require future defending. Over enough time, this produces a life shaped less by what a person actually wants to do and more by what can be easily defended if questioned, which is a much smaller and more cautious life than the one available to someone who isn't constantly pre-justifying their existence. The way out of this trap isn't to stop caring whether people understand your intentions. It's to recognize that your intentions are, in the end, something you have to hold for yourself, verified primarily by your own honest self-examination, rather than by successfully convincing an external audience. If you examine your own motives honestly and find them to be reasonably good, that internal verdict can be allowed to stand as sufficient, even when someone else remains unconvinced. This doesn't mean you stop explaining yourself to people who deserve context. It means the explanation stops being a desperate bid for a verdict you don't already trust, and becomes instead something offered freely, without the frantic undertone of a case that must be won. The difference is subtle from the outside, but enormous from the inside. One version leaves you dependent on a jury that may never return the verdict you're after, and the other leaves you as the one holding the gavel all along, which is where, in the matter of your own intentions, the authority actually belonged from the start. Chapter 9. When silence says more than defense. There is a moment, familiar to almost everyone, when an accusation or a harsh judgment lands, and the entire body seems to lean forward, ready to respond. Words are already forming. A defense is already being assembled, sometimes before the other person has even finished speaking. This forward lean feels, in the moment, like strength, like standing up for yourself, like refusing to let an unfair characterization pass unchallenged. But it's worth examining what actually happens, both to the situation and to the person doing the defending, when that instinct is followed automatically, rather than examined first. Reactive self-defense, offered in the heat of being judged, rarely lands the way it's intended to. This is one of the more counterintuitive truths about conflict and misunderstanding. The more urgently and immediately someone defends themselves against a judgment, the less convincing that defense tends to appear to an outside observer, and often even to the person being defended against. There's a simple psychological reason for this. Immediate, heated defense reads as reactive, and reactive responses are associated, fairly or not, with having something to protect. A person who is truly unbothered by an accusation, who knows with quiet certainty that it isn't true, often doesn't need to mount an urgent case. Their calm becomes its own kind of evidence, while an anxious, rapid-fire defense can inadvertently suggest the opposite of what it's trying to prove, even when the underlying claim being defended is completely true. This is not an argument that defending yourself is always wrong, or that composed silence is universally superior to speaking up. There are moments, particularly ones involving real consequences, safety, formal accusations, situations where a false narrative could cause lasting harm, where silence would be a genuine mistake, allowing something damaging to calcify uncontested. The distinction this chapter is drawing is narrower, between defense that is chosen, strategic, and clear-eyed, and defense that is simply the reflex firing on its own timeline, indistinguishable from panic, deployed in situations that didn't actually require an immediate response at all. Composed silence, used deliberately rather than as avoidance, does something that reactive defense cannot. It communicates, without a single word, that the judgment being leveled did not succeed in destabilizing the person it was aimed at. This is a genuinely different message than either agreement or argument. Agreement would signal that the judgment landed correctly. Argument, especially heated argument, signals that the judgment landed hard enough to require an urgent response. Silence, held steadily rather than anxiously, signals something else entirely. That the judgment simply didn't have the effect the speaker may have been hoping for. Whether that effect was to provoke, to control, or simply to be believed without question. There's an important internal distinction to make here, because silence can be performed just as anxiously as speech can. Silence born from freezing, from not knowing what to say, from swallowing a hurt that will resurface later as resentment, is not the same thing as the composed silence this chapter is describing. The first kind of silence is just the reflex to correct, suppressed rather than resolved, still generating the same internal churn, just without an outward expression. It tends to leak out eventually, in irritability, in distance, in a later moment when the unspoken defense finally erupts, often disproportionately, about something only distantly related. The second kind of silence, the genuinely composed kind, comes from a different place entirely. A settled internal sense that the judgment doesn't require a response, because it doesn't actually threaten anything real. That silence isn't holding anything back. There's simply nothing urgent that needs to be said. Learning to tell these two kinds of silence apart in yourself is one of the more useful skills this book can point toward. Because outwardly, in the moment, they can look identical. Both involve not speaking, but internally, one is a held breath and the other is an exhale. A useful way to check which one you're in is to notice what happens in your body a few minutes after the silent moment has passed. If you're still composing rebuttals in your head, still replaying the exchange, still feeling the urge to go back and say something, that was likely the first kind, suppression rather than composure, and it may be worth eventually addressing the underlying issue, just not necessarily in the heated moment itself. If, instead, the moment has genuinely passed, if your attention has moved on to whatever came next without a lingering need to return and set the record straight, that's a sign. The silence was the real thing. There is also a strategic dimension to composed silence that deserves honest acknowledgement, separate from its emotional or relational value. In many situations involving judgment or accusation, particularly ones playing out in front of an audience, whether a family gathering, a workplace conflict, or a public exchange online, the person who reacts defensively often ends up, whether fair or not, appearing to confirm that there's something worth reacting to. Observers frequently read urgency as guilt, even when it isn't, simply because urgency is the behavior most associated with having something to hide. A composed non-response, by contrast, tends to shift the burden back onto the original claim itself, forcing it to stand or fall on its own merits, rather than being propped up by the emotional spectacle of a heated denial. This isn't a manipulation tactic, so much as an accurate read of how judgment and credibility tend to actually function in front of other people. Defense often does more to legitimize an accusation by treating it as something requiring an urgent rebuttal than silence ever does. None of this is to suggest that silence should become a new performance, a strategic tool deployed for optics, while the internal experience remains just as reactive as ever. That would simply be the trap from the previous chapter, wearing a different costume, proving your intentions through the absence of words instead of the presence of them, still driven by the same underlying need for the judgment to be overturned. The real shift being pointed toward here is deeper than technique. It's the slow development of an internal state where silence in the face of judgment isn't a strategy you're deploying, but simply the natural, unforced expression of not needing that particular judgment to change in order to remain steady. Once that internal state is genuinely present, the silence stops requiring effort. It stops being something you have to choose and hold on to through gritted teeth. It becomes, instead, simply what happens when a false or unfair judgment meets a person who was never going to be moved by it in the first place, because their footing was never actually resting on the outcome of that particular exchange. Chapter 10. The Freedom of Unmanaged Perception. There is a particular kind of tiredness that only becomes visible once it lifts. The way you don't fully register how tightly you were holding your shoulders until the moment they finally drop. For most people who have spent years managing the reflex, this book has been examining, correcting, explaining, performing intentions, defending against every misjudgment. That tiredness has become so constant, it no longer registers as tiredness at all. It just feels like how life is. It is only when a person begins to genuinely loosen their grip on how others perceive them that the weight of the old habit becomes visible in its absence, in the sudden strange lightness of a day that used to be quietly, invisibly full of small acts of image maintenance. This chapter is an attempt to describe what actually becomes available on the other side of that loosening, not as an abstract virtue, but as a concrete, livable difference in the texture of daily experience. The first and most immediate shift is in attention. Once you stop treating every misread moment as an emergency requiring intervention, an enormous amount of mental bandwidth simply returns to you, the same bandwidth that used to be quietly siphoned off toward monitoring, rehearsing, and correcting. This isn't a metaphorical gain. It's a literal redistribution of where your mind spends its time. Conversations become something you can actually be inside of, rather than something you're simultaneously having and evaluating from the outside for how you're coming across. Ordinary moments, a walk, a meal, a quiet evening, stop being background noise behind a low, constant hum of unresolved social business. The hum quiets. What's left is simply more room, and that room tends to fill almost immediately with a fuller kind of presence in whatever you're actually doing. The second shift is relational, and it tends to surprise people who haven't experienced it yet. The expectation, before this shift happens, is usually that relaxing your grip on perception will mean your relationships suffer, that people will form more wrong impressions of you, and those impressions will accumulate into real damage. What tends to happen instead is closer to the reverse. Relationships built on constant clarification and defense often carry a subtle undercurrent of strain, a sense, however unspoken, that the connection requires active maintenance to stay intact. When that maintenance eases, when you stop needing every interaction to land exactly as intended, relationships often become easier to be in, not harder. People sense, even without being able to name it, that they don't have to handle you carefully, that an offhand comment or an imperfect explanation won't trigger an elaborate repair process. This tends to invite more honesty from others, not less, because the atmosphere around you stops feeling like one that punishes minor missteps in communication. The third shift is the hardest to describe, but perhaps the most significant. A change in the relationship you have with yourself, independent of anyone else's involvement at all. When your sense of who you are no longer depends on winning every interpretation, on ensuring the story other people carry about you matches your internal picture in real time, something changes in how you hold your own identity. It stops being a case that needs to be continually re-argued and starts being something closer to simply true, background, settled, not up for constant re-litigation. This is not the same as arrogance or a lack of self-reflection. It's closer to the difference between a house built on a foundation and a house that has to be actively held up by hand, moment to moment, or it will fall. The first kind of house allows you to actually live in it. The second kind requires so much structural attention that living in it fully was never really possible. It's worth being honest that this freedom doesn't arrive as a single decision or a permanent state achieved once and then kept forever. The reflex to correct doesn't disappear. It quiets, and it can still flare in moments of real vulnerability, particularly with people whose opinions genuinely matter, or in situations that touch on old wounds, where being misjudged once carried real cost. The difference, on the other side of the work this book has been pointing toward, isn't the absence of the reflex. It's a changed relationship to it, the ability to feel the old alarm rise, recognize it for what it is, and choose deliberately whether the situation actually calls for a response, rather than being pulled along automatically by an ancient wiring that was built for a different kind of danger than the one currently present. There is also something worth saying about what this freedom is not, because it can be easy to mistake it for detachment or coldness, a shrugging indifference to how you affect other people. That isn't what's being described here. A person who has genuinely done this work still cares about being understood by the people who matter to them. They still explain themselves when explanation serves the relationship. They still correct real, consequential misunderstandings when something meaningful is actually at stake. What's gone isn't caring. What's gone is the compulsion, the sense that every gap in perception is an emergency, that every misjudgment must be addressed the moment it appears, that the self requires constant external ratification in order to remain intact. Caring without compulsion is a genuinely different way of moving through the world than caring that has become indistinguishable from anxiety, even though from the outside they can sometimes look similar. What becomes possible? Ultimately, once perception stops being something you feel responsible for managing at every turn, is a kind of quiet authorship over your own life that was previously being outsourced, piece by piece, to whoever happened to be forming an opinion of you in a given moment. You stop writing your days around anticipated misunderstandings and their necessary corrections. You start writing them instead, around what you actually want to do, say, and become, with the understanding that some people, at some points, will get you wrong, and that this has always been true, for everyone, throughout the whole of human history, and has never actually been the catastrophe it can feel like in the moment. The story other people carry about you was never fully within your control to begin with. What was always within your control, and what this entire book has been circling toward, is the story you carry about yourself, and whether that story needs anyone else's signature to remain true.